So it's very interesting. Over the last few weeks, I had several conversations with few members of this community about the meaning of ritual, and then the fact that a classic liberal position would always be ethics ethics over ritual, and to try to reduce the doing something as a formality and try to find meaning in everything, which is very tricky, which is really hard. And I think that this week's Torah portion is partly about it as well, this question. So there is a well-known tale that tells a story of a group of blind people who encounter an elephant for the first time in their life. I think many of you know it. So they are curious about what an elephant looks like, and they decide to touch it and describe it to each other. However, each person touches a different part of elephant's body, and they end up with very different descriptions. So one person touches the trunk and says, well, elephant is like a snake. It's long and flexible and can move in any directions. Okay, so another person touches the ear and says, the elephant is like a wing. It's large and thin and can flap in the air. A third person touches the leg and says, no, elephant is like a tree. It's thick and sturdy and can support a lot of weight. A fourth person touches the tail and says, elephant is like a rope. It's hairy and can swing from side to side. So they start to argue with each other, each claiming that their description is the correct one. So, and of course, they accuse each other of lying. So, who is lying here? And who is telling the truth? So, actually, this fascinating phenomenon has a name. It's many people call it a Rashman effect. So it refers to a situation where different witnesses of the same event give contradictory and inconsistent accounts of what happens. So the term comes from a Japanese film by Akira Kurosawa called Rashman, in which four characters narrate their view or their version of a crime scene they witnessed. The film shows how each person's perspective, memory, bias, self-interest, or just their view, their perspective, shape their stories, and how the truth, in fact, is subjective and not absolute. So the studies about Rashman effect raise important and fundamental questions. So what is truth? Are you comfortable with the idea that truth is not objective? Reality is constructed by our interpretations and narratives, and that we can never fully know what really happened if we only rely on people's memory. Is our memory real? I think that Rashman effect is exactly what happens in this week's Torah portion. So many weeks ago, in Parashat Shlach Lecha, the Numbers 13 and 14, God commands Moses to send a leader from each tribe. And this is, I put them side to side. On the right, the bits that we've just read from this week's Torah portion. On the left, the one from many weeks ago, from the book of Numbers. So, the book of Numbers, במדבר. וידבר אדוני אל משה לאמור, שלח לך אנשים ויתורו את ארץ כנען. Right? The Eternal One spoke to Moses, saying, send agents to scout or spy out the land of Canaan. The version of the Spies story found in this week's Torah portion is different. In this recollection by Moses, it's not God who commands Moses to send the spies, but people who come to Moses, demanding the spies to make the journey. So what was it? God commanding or people requesting? Of course, more believable for us is the people, but we don't know. So in the book of Numbers, the spies are also the main focus of the episode. Their decision, the spies' decision, And the lack of their trust leads people to 40 years of wandering. In the book of Deuteronomy, it is not the spies, but the entire people who are guilty and bear responsibility for these episodes. So what is it? Again, and many commentators noticed it, so I wasn't the first one. But Abarbanel, the 15th century Italian scholar, offered a very, very interesting commentary on the Deuteronomy 22. So he writes, the reason for all of this is that Moses was speaking with the second generation. And if they heard the truth of the incident as it happened, they would say that the reason for the delay in the desert, and they would say that the reason for the delay in the desert was God. They would say, well, why did God put a stumbling block in front of the blind? People didn't know. Of course, you knew as God, you bear responsibility. Why did you ask them? Why did you ask them to go and look at the land? Of course, you knew that they would vote against. So why did you ask? And they would also speak about Moses, thinking that Moses was also truly a cause for their delay. 40 years, it's a lifetime. So it's their parents who didn't receive it. So it is how could you? And because Moses gave instructions to the spy that the people hadn't asked for and God hadn't commanded. And Moses also saw that if he told them what the spies had really said, that the land was the one who ate its inhabitants. That was what the spies said in the book of Numbers. The land eats its inhabitants. That's scary. Perhaps this would affect the hearts of people now as well, and they would be afraid and intimidated from going into the land, like their ancestors had done. So in other words, Abarbanel thought that Moses deliberately changed the truth, changed the story, and lied about what happened. He offered an interpretation of the events that was useful for the audience at that time, for the second generation, so that he could achieve an ultimate goal of bringing people and inspiring people to enter the land. He was afraid that people would get afraid. He was scared that people would get afraid and stop believing in themselves if they knew the full truth. Therefore, he skipped some parts and changed others to inspire people and make them believe that they could be better than their ancestors. Of course, in our time, it's absolutely unheard of that a leader would lie about the past events. But perhaps in medieval Italy, it was normal. So Nechama Leibovitz, the modern Israeli scholar, offers a slightly different perspective. She writes that in Numbers, Moses speaks as a historian recounting the events as they took place. But in Deuteronomy, he is delivering a moral discourse, urging the people to learn the lesson of history. So it's not enough to know the facts, she says. You need to learn lessons from it. So Leibovitz writes that Moses recalls that it was the people who initiated the idea of spying out the land, and he does so to be able to draw a morale, to emphasize the direct responsibility of their ancestors of their actions. They had wanted to send spies in the first place, and their responsibility for what happened afterwards was even greater. Moses, says Leibovitz, wishes to stress this point. So the Torah here wishes to teach us an important lesson. Human beings are put to the test by God at every moment of their existence. She writes, the ears hear and the heart is seduced. But the question becomes, is the listener who is misled by the seducer free from all moral responsibility? The Torah makes each person, or at least Moses in Deuteronomy, makes each person responsible for his or her actions. The listener has a choice of turning the deaf ear to evil and misleading words. Choice belongs to us. we have the duty to resist. Each of us has to be their own leader, responsible for every action and not just a cog in the vast machine called society. In other words, Moses deliberately changed the story to say that it's not enough to trust our leaders. We need to be mindful of their potential mistakes. All of us have to be involved in society all the time. So according to classical rabbinic text, Mishnah, the narrative of the transgression of spies, the spy story, is dated on which day? On the 9th of Av. So they thought that this episode, the sin, transgression, or mistake of spies, happened on the 9th of Av, the tragic and the saddest day in Jewish history. Time after time, catastrophes fall on this day, so that it was institutionalized as a national day of fast, accumulating its own complex history of loss. So Tish'a B'Av is a collective day of mourning. It has a long list. Some websites list as long as 40 different events in Jewish history that happened on the 9th of Av, connecting the 9th of Av with the Second World War, with the final solution, even with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bomb, with the First World War, with the King Edward's edict to expel Jews from England. All of this happened on the 9th of Av, according to our tradition. So Tish'a B'Av is the day when both also First and Second Temple were destroyed. But the story of spies was the first of all tragedies that happened on Tish'a B'Av. Was it as bad as everything else that I just listed? It's just the story of spies, right? So they brought a wrong report, and that's it. So what was so bad in this story that it became the saddest day of Jewish year? There were other options. There were other disasters in Jewish history. The slavery of Egypt, for example, was really bad. So why spies? Why did Rabbi start the chain of tragedies with this story? So later, Talmudic rabbis reflected on this day and tried to articulate reasons for the destruction of both First and Second Temples, as well as the destruction of Jerusalem and the loss of sovereignty of Jewish people. And they articulated this reason. So they suggested many reasons, but this is, I think, very relevant for us. Jerusalem was destroyed only because the people didn't speak out and criticize one another for their wrongdoings. So it's not only the fault of leaders that led to the disaster, but also people's indifference. It is not only the search of truth and facts that matters, but the search of meaning. And the meaning comes also only in discussion, in criticizing each other. So there can and should be different truths. There can be more than one correct answer to the same question, more than one version of historical events, but there cannot be complacency and turning blind eye to the suffering of others. Let us not be a generation who believes all reports, but the generation who questions and adds healthy pinch of criticism to everything we hear. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will.